and welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week I am joined by Tahir Amin to discuss his co-authored book, Pharma Monopoly, The Battle for the Future of Medicines. Tahir Amin is a founder and CEO of the Initiative for Medicines, Access, and Knowledge, better known as I-MAK. He has spent over 2 decades working in the global access to medicines movement, addressing the systemic inequalities in how medicines are developed and distributed. He has over 30 years of experience in the field of intellectual property, during which he practiced as an attorney with 2 of the leading law firms in the UK and for multinational corporations. So let's get right into it. So welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am joined today by Tahir to talk about his most recent release, Pharma Monopoly, The Battle for the Future of Medicines.
Thank
Tahir,
you.
if you want to introduce yourself a little bit.
Yep, I'm Tahir Amin. I am a co-founder and the CEO of an organization called the Initiative for Medicines, Access, and Knowledge, and have recently co-authored a book called Pharma Monopoly with Rohit Malpani.
Awesome. So with this book, where did the idea for this book kind of come about?
I think it was really rooted in COVID. I and my co-author have been in the field of what is more commonly known as the access to medicines movement, trying to make medicines affordable around the world. And during COVID, we really saw the great disparities in who received vaccines, who received the treatments in order to address COVID. And in a way, it was a kind of a vaccine apartheid, as reporters and many of us were feeling at that time. There was this global north-south divide. And we look back at the work we had been doing over the last, at that point, it was 17 years, and all the solutions that had been proposed, and really started to reflect at what had happened. Why was this playing out in the biggest health crises since the HIV pandemic in the late 90s, early 2000s? And actually reflected back on how did this system become what it did, and why is it playing out the way it is? And so went down a lot of rabbit holes, and that's how the book really came about. It was a kind of almost like we've been doing this for 20 years and shouldn't we have progressed much further in terms of the outcomes and the solutions on the table, yet we were nowhere near that, and the failure of COVID and potentially for the next pandemic as well. And so really wanted to voice that and also ideas that have been percolating for over a decade, and to really put them out.
So for the book, it covers quite a span of time, about 50 or so years. So what did the writing process look like to back at this time period to get it all collectively into one place?
Yeah, that was a real struggle. I mean, particularly some of the chapters really were areas of work that on a day-to-day basis, I don't think either of us get into, and certainly I don't. And so, for example, in chapter 2, we're looking at the history of how the World Trade Organization came to be, which dictates a lot of the things that we saw play out during COVID in terms of the intellectual property rules. But I wanted to go back further, because I led on that chapter. I wanted to go back much further because as COVID was happening, and we saw this great divide between the haves and have-nots in the global south and north terminology that we use in the book, there was a prehistory which often doesn't get talked about. And this history is countries coming out of European empires that were breaking up after World War II, and the movement to an international trade organization, which died very quickly around 1945. This was during the Bretton Woods Accords, which was a new economic system post-World War II. And so that didn't happen. And then the global south countries who were coming out of colonization were trying to sort of get into the economic system, because until then they'd been colonized largely, and really wanted to trace that prehistory, which even in our field, which when we do this access to medicines work, does not get spoken about. Everything, even academic texts and a lot of literature, just starts when the World Trade Organization really started to emerge in the 1980s. And so there was that, and then there was also other chapters in terms of how the modern financialized system, which is really sort of how the pharmaceutical system has become much more of a financial business model driven by the likes of Wall Street. That has a prehistory as well. The context of innovation, the language of innovation, where did that spring up from? Was that, today we just take it for granted as part of our vocabulary, but actually there's a prehistory there, there's a history. And, one of the things was in the writing process, it's very hard. And the lesson learned in this process is don't write and research at the same time. It's really hard. And so trying to do that on a timeline and a deadline was probably the hardest thing. And of course, co-authoring has its own sort of processes because you've got different ideas, different viewpoints, and trying to get that all into one book in a way that is meeting both people's voices. So yeah, those are some of the real memories of writing this book in terms of the history, the research, and the co-authorship.
Yeah. So in the process of you explaining how the book came to be, you mentioned the global north and the global south. And before we get into too much more of the discussion of the content, maybe we can talk a little bit about what the global north and the global south are for people who might not have heard those terms before.
Yeah, these terms are largely academic terms they're not precise. And so, but it's very hard to say, well, what is the global north and global south? Traditionally, it's the industrialized countries, the Europes and the North Americas, the countries that are deemed developed economically, and the wealthier countries. Although one would say Japan is maybe global south, but it's still in the global, there's that. And Australia is definitely maybe in the south, but it's considered global north. So we use that, and global south is largely the majority world that was either under colonization or is usually south of the equator. But it's not a precise definition, but it's usually the wealthier versus what people may call developing countries or least developed countries. That's the kind of the term that I prefer to use, and many do as well, because it's the language of developed. And I mean, I sometimes feel, just because you're economically developed, you might not be spiritually developed, but those are different discussions.
So with that, I think one other thing we should probably talk about first is the TRIPS agreement that came up quite a few times throughout the book. And I think that would be a good groundwork for the rest of the conversation.
So the TRIPS agreement, the creation of the World Trade Organization, there's various agreements within the creation of the World Trade Organization. And the TRIPS agreement is a big component when it comes to medicines and the rules of intellectual property. As I said, when we were looking at the prehistory of what led up to that, there was a movement in the 70s. Basically, it started post-World War II. There was a movement in the 70s where a lot of the global south countries felt that the economic circumstances and the political economy, the trading systems were not in their favor, and they needed to sort of try and get on their own feet. And so they felt that the rules of the trading system needed to be changed. And so in the 70s, they pushed for what was called a new international economic order, which is also basically that they have sovereignty over their own raw materials. And also there would be technology transfer because they've been basically colonized and they had no access to the science and the development of that. And so they wanted to have these abilities to be more self-serving and non-dependent. But that all fell away in the late 70s, early 80s, largely because there was a massive economic collapse globally in the 70s and early 80s. There was debt. The countries just couldn't, they had to pay off these debt. They had these structural adjustment loans from the IMF and World Bank. And so they were just, that whole movement just fell apart. But what replaced it was this other movement that was happening in kind of parallel, but much quieter in the 70s, where CEOs from some of the big multinational companies like Pfizer, the drug company, and IBM were trying to say, well, actually the world is catching up in terms of they're going to become more competitive. We need to have some new rules of trade and are going to basically lose our ability to generate profit and have control of the marketplace. And, there was competition with Japan and Germany now and the global south countries that were emerging. And so they concocted this idea that we need to have rules around intellectual property. Now, intellectual property is typically patents, trademarks, copyright. So this was the new economy. This was the knowledge economy that had emerged as technology had started to take hold after World War II. And in order to maintain their comparative advantage, they said, right, well, we're the ones with the technology sort of exporters. And so in the late 70s, early 80s, they started pushing this idea that intellectual property and these various intellectual property rights like patents, trademarks should be in the trading system. And that never had existed before. So a lot of the global south countries resisted that over a decade. And then by the early 1990s, the resistance had been kind of picked off. There was a lot of divide and rule by the US and the Europeans. In fact, the Europeans and the Japanese were even into this idea in the initial place. It was the US that promoted it because it was a lot of their interests. And so by the early 90s, the kind of resistance had fallen away from India and Brazil and Pakistan and Egypt, who were the main kind of last ones standing. And then the World Trade Organization came into being in 1994. It was signed in Marrakesh, and then officially in 1995. And then there was a whole bunch of rules within that these countries had to now, at least the least developing countries had a transition period, much longer, which they still are in. whereas countries like India and Brazil and what have you had 10 years within which to kind of meet these obligations, these basic rules that they had to protect intellectual property. And so that became the baseline, even though many of these countries never had these rules before. And they could actually make the medicines that they wanted and generic. And India was like the home of the generic industry called the pharmacy of the poor. And they were supplying many of the HIV medicines that people in Africa needed for much cheaper. And so really that's what created this movement. It was a huge case that happened in South Africa where Mandela's government tried to use some of what flexibilities within the trade agreement, the TRIPS agreement, to try and import generic medicines because South Africa in the late 90s had the high HIV numbers, and 40 pharmaceutical companies, the big Western pharmaceutical companies, sued Mandela's government. So remember, this is just after apartheid. And they sued the Mandela's government. Eventually, the companies withdrew the complaint because of the mass media attention and the civil society sprung up, particularly in South Africa. And it's what really gave birth to what is called the Access to Medicine in South Africa and all the work that we've been doing over the last 20 years.
So you mentioned briefly the patented medications, which this was newer information to me about the way that patents work with medicines and how they can be extended over time so that like something that had like an 18-year term now has 24 years or longer, and how that affects the access to generics. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the patent medications fit into this?
Yeah. So one of the big drivers of the TRIPS agreement was the pharmaceutical industry. Pfizer, literally one of the main architects of that. And today the pharmaceutical industry is the big purveyor and defender of it all. And because they argue that they need these patents to do the research and development. So for example, today the universal standard is you get 20 years for a patent from the date of filing. Now, as soon as a patent's filed, you may be still in research and development, and typically it might take anywhere between 6 to 10 years to develop the drug to get it regulatory approval from the various FDA agency or whichever agency it is. And so basically then you've got 10 years of exclusivity. But there are so many other overlapping intellectual property rights, for example, data exclusivity, which is like any clinical data that a company has to develop during the development of the drug through clinical trials. That is also protected, and that was also a feature of the TRIPS agreement that never existed before. Again, all springing from laws in the United States that had come in domestically first. And so yeah, patents are basically, you think you get one patent on a drug and then that's the end of it. It's 20 years, game over. After 20 years, the generics come in. But over the years, and this ties with the chapter 6, which is talking about the word financialization of when pharmaceutical companies have really become almost like investment vehicles to drive and maximizing profit. So what's the best way to drive revenue for your product without going back to the lab and creating a new one is to try and extend the patent. And so the industry doesn't like to use the word, we don't want to extend patents, but what it is that they just have all these overlapping patents for different features of a drug, or even just patents to create barriers for any competitor trying to get in. Because if you're trying to come up as a competitor with a different version of a drug, if somebody has a patent on it already, you've got to go around it. You've got to just basically avoid it like a landmine. And so what they do is they set all these traps. They may never use those patents, but it's all a way of creating these landmines so that competitors have to tiptoe around them or avoid them. And often, sometimes they say, this is not worth my while because to litigate through all this, it's going to cost me millions of dollars. And so it's easier to file an application because it's a lot cheaper than to actually litigate one. And so it's become a system now, the patent system, a way of, it's not about, in its early years, about, flashes of genius and invention. It's a business tool to basically extract as much revenue by creating these barriers to competition. Sure, the patent system has served a purpose to get some drug developed and onto the market, but I think a lot of that knowledge is either public knowledge that we as taxpayers fund, but then goes into private hands. That was one of the features of Chapter 5 about how the language of innovation took over. The invention happens with public dollars and research, and then the innovation, which are two very different concepts, happens from the industry who are commercializing it and then make all the profit. This is how the finance system has become. It's become an engine for financial engineering.
With the financing of the medications, with these corporations, the CEOs of them are oftentimes billionaires, and they are making record profits off of these medications that for most people are life-saving medications, and they raise the price of them to get the most profit off of them. Can we talk a little bit about how this price gouging of the medication has affected the world of pharmacy medications with the monopoly?
Yeah, often, this is one of the things that the book tries to address or look at is often the narrative has been for a long while that it's only in the global south countries, the less wealthy countries, that access to medicines is a problem, affordability is a problem. But if you look in the United States, for example, 1 in 3 Americans cannot afford to fill their prescription. That's an astonishing statistic. And that's been a statistic that, based on year surveys done by various groups, shown. My organization also did a survey last year. And, it's bipartisan. It wasn't supposed to be like addressing a particular viewpoint. It's across the board. And so to give an example, you take a drug like Humira, which is for rheumatoid arthritis. A lot of seniors take the drug. What AbbVie, the company that was the patent holder on that particular product, what they did, their main patent, the original patent, if you might say, was supposed to come off in 2016. It was supposed to expire. But what they had built was a fortress of patents. The language that is often used in media, or what we use in the field, is a patent thicket. And we had identified something like over 300 patent applications, of which nearly 200 had been granted. And I don't think that was the full universe of patents, because trying to identify these things is so obfuscated. It's very hard. It's not just easy to kind of get this information. And what AbbVie was able to achieve was to keep competition off because of all these patents. So they get into litigation. This is how it all works. So basically, you've got two private actors, the generic or biosimilar companies, which make biologic drugs. And the generics are usually small, sort of pills and tablet type drugs. And they get into litigation. And then you've got these two private actors deciding when a competitor is going to come to market. It's not the government. It's not the patent office that gives these patents. Patent office just literally is granting patents left, right, and center. And so AbbVie's got all these patents, which they're throwing in litigation. I think in one litigation, they threw nearly 80 patents at one company. And as a company, I'm from the private sector as a lawyer, just no way you can afford millions of dollars to get through that whole mess. And so they all settle. They all make a settlement agreement, and they say, well, we're not going to come to market until 2023. So that gives AbbVie another 7 years of pure monopoly in the marketplace, when really it should have ended in 2017 at least. And that's what happened in Europe. It came in 2018, prices dropped almost 80%. But what these settlements were, and there was a bargain actually that was struck, that AbbVie would give up the European market, they wouldn't contest it, and they would preserve the US one, which is where most of their money is made. And just in those 7 years, forget about the other sort of 11 years, because, well, not 11, it was approved first at the end of 2002, so nearly 14 years. In just 7 years, they made in revenue, I think it was $114 billion. And in that 7 years, the price almost went up twofold. So this is what the patent system does. And Keytruda, a cancer drug, which many people are trying to sort of have access to. Again, the patent story there is playing out. The patent's supposed to come off in 2028, but what Merck has done is they switched it to a slightly different formulation. And so they restocked the clock of the patent. So this is technically an extension of their monopoly. I mean, they used other patents to extend it, and they'll say, oh, these are all individual innovations, quote unquote. But they're not. They're just strategic business moves to basically maintain the monopoly. And so as the market shifts to maybe a competing version in IV form, they're now going to offer you an injection. And it's not any more therapeutically better. It's just more convenient. And so this is what they do. And this is what the business model has become. It's like basically they're answerable to their shareholders and their investors and their quarterly reports. And so basically the CEO's earnings are basically linked to how the share value. And so they're the motivations. It's not how am I going to help people get healthier? The motivation is how am I going to make sure that my shareholders are going to get their returns?
I found that piece of it, and then them purchasing rights to certain medications that had been around since like the 60s, and they were really cheap, but then someone bought them and now they're like 1,000 times the price that they were. It's a little disheartening because medication is one of those things that at some point in your life, literally every single person will probably need a medication. And to bar access to that just for profits for shareholders and not even putting that money back into research and development, but just holding on to it instead of trying to advance, it really, I don't know. As a person, it's very upsetting to read something.
You just raised a point. I just written an op-ed, which is related to a part of the book in chapter 6, where we talk about these GLP-1 drugs, the weight loss drugs, the diabetes drugs, which are a huge conversation at the moment. And so Novo Nordisk, the Danish company, has the branded products Ozempic, Wegovy. The other one is Rybelsus. These are all based around the same active ingredient. Now, just a few months ago, March, the patents expired. The main original patent expired in Canada. There was a reason for that that's specific, but I won't get into it too detailed. But let's just say the patent expired, and in India, they've expired. So generics have entered in those countries, and the prices have dropped 80% in India, for example. In the US and in Europe too, they will not see competing versions until 2031-32 because there's this statutory patent extension that the US allows. So it gives them another 5 years of protection. This is something that the industry lobbied for in the early 80s. And when you look at the revenue that Novo Nordisk makes on these called semaglutide-based products, as Ozempic, Wegovy, and Rybelsus, it's projected that in just that 5 years, and we've modeled it on a very conservative basis, they're going to make in revenue in 5 years because of that extension, $146 billion. And the thing is, they say, oh, well, we need all that money, or we need these revenues and profits to put back into R&D. Well, we looked at how much they are giving back to their shareholders. And it turns out that they're basically, for every 72 cents in a dollar is going to go to shareholders. And so this narrative that the industry completely lies about as saying that we're putting this all into the R&D or, our employees or whatever. No, the only people who are benefiting are the investors and shareholders and the CEOs, the executives. They are getting the bulk of the money that we as a public are having to they're extracting it from us to serve themselves. But use the argument that, if we don't have all these intellectual property rights and these longer term patents and what have you, we would never get these new drugs.
Yeah, it's something that I think will take quite some time to fix.
Yeah, sadly, but that's one of the reasons why we wanted to write the book as well, is that actually a lot of the fixes and the solutions, and this is where we were in COVID, were incremental, and they were keeping the power structures in place. And I think after 20 years of doing this work, we felt that it's time to take the gloves off a little bit and really speak some truths.
One of the last things before we go is the end of the book. It finishes with where AI fits into this. And AI, just in the last 2 years, has overtaken many, many aspects of our daily lives. And now it's in our medicines as well. So if you want to talk a little bit about how we've got here with AI and where AI fits into this model.
Yeah, that whole question is still unraveling. But as far as the way I see it, at least, is what we're going to see is like almost the same way we were told about, as our technology improves, as we get more tech savvy, it's going to make things faster and more cheaper. Well, actually, it's not. It's never had. If you look at the R&D costs of drugs, they keep going up. These are all industry figures, by the way. 800 million, now it's 2.7 billion. I thought we were supposed to be getting more technologically proficient. But no, it's all designed to kind of extract more revenue and money. And with AI, I feel, sure, there are potential outcomes that can be had in terms of screening compounds, developing drugs much more quickly. But at the same time, I feel, and we mentioned this in the book, it's going to become more personalized. It's going to be driven towards people's profiles and the data that they collect. And so basically they're going to target the really wealthy people, and they're not going to develop drugs for the average person. And if they are, they're not going to be developed to the same extent. And so basically, I think that's one area where AI is going to basically create even further have-nots in some ways, despite all the language of, it's going to make things more democratic. They said that about the internet and social media and networks and what have you, and look where we are. But the other worrying thing is, and I'm still unpacking this for myself, is from an intellectual property side, I see this as a continuation of the extraction of knowledge, but in a different way. So typically, with intellectual property was you patent something and then you hold that and you privatize knowledge. And I think the language of innovation has enabled that, because in order to kind of grow the economy when there was stagflation, there was an economic crisis in the 70s, and the industrial policy of innovation really sprung up. And it was all about basically, how do we give these rights to companies? We need to incentivize them to invest money, really that they invent anything, but that they will develop more products and what have you. And so the language of innovation really sprung up. And I think AI is a kind of the end game of this, where basically now, rather than the traditional intellectual property appropriations of knowledge, what you're going to have is you're going to have companies who are literally scraping all this knowledge from wherever they may lie, and it's going to be privatized in the hands of a few. Because there aren't that many AI-driven companies that are going to have that power. They don't have the infrastructure, I mean, all the servers and cloud, all that stuff. So these people are going to then be the holders of knowledge, which previously was maybe scattered around these big corporations like the big companies, which are under the patent system. That I think this is the next step of that. I know I'm probably predicting something that hasn't happened yet, but I think that is where we're going to end up, is where few people are going to be controlling the knowledge, which should be free knowledge, public knowledge. They're going to be controlling it through these algorithms. And, what's interesting is, and I'll finish on this point on the AI subject, is speaking to some people who know, for example, scientists who work in some of these big pharmaceutical companies. I won't mention names. And one story really astonished me, and it's also happening in other industries as well, other fields, was the person's colleague that they know works in this company was saying that they have to use the AI systems that are installed in the pharmaceutical. So they have these platforms which are developed by OpenAI for that particular company, and they have to basically use it because they want all that information that's coming out of their brain is going into the AI system. Then eventually they'll get rid of the employee. And what they're doing is they're sucking the brains and the knowledge from people who have that expertise. And eventually it's all going to sit in these algorithms. And they are going to be the one who's control it and then charge us for it. And this should be free. This is knowledge that is ours. Just the way the intellectual property system is taking a lot of knowledge and privatizing it under patent terms and what have you. AI is the next sort of frontier of that.
Yes, AI is scary.
Yeah.
The way that it is moving forward. Yeah. So on that note, thank you for coming on today and talking about your book and the Pharma Monopoly and how we've gotten to where we are today. I think for change to happen, awareness is one of the first things that needs to happen. And I think reading this book will bring more awareness to the public about what the situation actually is. And then from there, change can happen. And I think this is one of the first steps in making that change.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for having me on to speak about an issue which is, I think is a lot of people in the United States and I know globally as well, because I work globally. I think it's definitely an issue that most people care about because everyone's had an experience or know someone who's had to go through these, needing the access to the medications. And this is really not a global north-south thing. It's an everyone thing. It's how do we make a better, more just world where people don't have to go bankrupt or die because they can't get the medicines that they actually want to take.
Yeah. So when this book is releasing May 26th, I believe.
That's right. Yep. Comes out in a couple of weeks.
So I'll make sure to include a link in the description on where you can find the book. Is there anywhere that people can find you?
Yeah, there's my website is Tahir with a hyphen Amin. You can also find me at I-MAK-imac.org, which is the organization that I co-founded and run on X, though very limited because it's become very polluted. It's the real Tahir Amin. There, I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me there. But yeah, those are the places. And I hope that people do get the chance to read the book.
Thank you. Thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Madison. I appreciate it.
Thank you again to Tahir for coming on today's show. If you're interested in reading Pharma Monopoly yourself, I have included a link to the book in the description below. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.